Back in the summer of 2016, my buddy Caleb and I took one of those road trips you plan in your 20s when you've got more time than money, and way too much curiosity for your own good. The plan was simple. Hit the road, no real destination. Just see what kind of weird, off-the-map places we could find between Utah and California. We had a reliable old Ford Explorer, a couple of sleeping bags in the back, and a shared playlist called Desert Madness, full of old-school rock and unsettling ambient tracks. Stupid, I know. But we were in that mood where you romanticize being a little creeped out. Like you want to see something weird, but only if it doesn't get too real. About a week into the trip, we were deep in Nevada. Real desolate stuff. Gas stations every 100 miles, if you were lucky. We'd just passed through a small town called Rachel, the one near Area 51. And yeah, we knew the jokes. We'd heard about Route 375, the so-called extraterrestrial highway, and figured, why not? What's a road trip without a little urban legend sightseeing? By the time we veered off the main route, it was close to midnight. The stars were insane. No light pollution, no clouds, just this black velvet sky absolutely ripped open with stars. The kind of view that makes you feel like you're on the edge of something bigger than you can understand. That's when we saw it. Out in the distance, maybe a mile from the road, was this faint glowing patch of light. Not headlights, not a building with porch lights. This was organized, sterile. White trailers arranged in a grid, bright floodlights. A few satellite dishes or maybe radar units. Whatever it was, it definitely wasn't on any map, and it didn't have a single identifying sign. Naturally, we were dumb enough to go check it out. We pulled off the highway and drove through the brush until we were maybe 100 yards away from the edge of the facility. There was a chain-link fence with barbed wire on top, but no gate, no guards, no signs saying no trespassing or government property. Just silence. Caleb turned off the engine and we sat there in total stillness. I remember rolling down the window. It wasn't cold, but the air felt wrong, like too still, too quiet, not even bugs. We were whispering. Why? I don't know. I guess the whole thing felt sacred or forbidden in a way. We watched for a few minutes. No movement, no sound. Just those harsh artificial lights casting long black shadows behind the trailers. Then, all at once, the floodlights snapped off. Not flickered, not dimmed, just off. It was like the whole place blinked out of existence. We both shouted, totally spooked. I threw the car in reverse and backed us up like we'd just poked a bear. For a second, I thought maybe we'd tripped some kind of motion detector or infrared alarm, and someone was on their way to tell us we'd seen too much. But as we drove off, Caleb turned to me, and I'll never forget the look on his face. Dead pale, eyes wide, lips barely moving. He just said, "Where did it go?" I slammed the brakes, threw it into park. Looked back through the rear window. Gone. Not dark. Gone. There was nothing back there. No lights, no buildings, no fence. Just desert. We got out, walked a few feet back in the direction we came. Nothing. Open sand and shrubs. Not even tire tracks or indentations in the dirt. The land was completely undisturbed. At that point, I honestly thought we'd lost our minds. We didn't say much the rest of the night. Found a turnout, parked, and slept with one eye open. Caleb kept saying he felt like we'd wandered through a curtain we weren't supposed to see behind. But here's the part that still chills me. We went back the next morning. With the sun up everything should have been clearer, right? Same exact location. Nothing there. Not a single man-made structure. No trailers, no fence, no packed-down dirt. Just sand, sagebrush, and the occasional jackrabbit hopping by like nothing ever happened. We retraced our route 3 times. Even used GPS tracking history to make sure we were at the same spot. We were, but there was no sign that anything had ever been there. It was like the whole facility had been a mirage, or like it had folded in on itself and slipped into another layer of reality. Caleb wouldn't even talk about it for the rest of the trip. He tried to joke about it a few times, but you could tell it haunted him. Me? I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a mobile testing unit, something military-related, and they packed up quickly. But how do you erase an entire fenced compound, radar dishes, and floodlights overnight without leaving anything behind? And that weird silence, the deadness in the air. It's been almost 10 years and I still think about it all the time. I'll be driving through some rural stretch of land and I'll get this chill. That same feeling like I'm being watched by something just beyond the edge of understanding. Was it aliens? Some kind of cloaking technology? A hallucination? I don't know, but I do know one thing for sure. We saw something real that night, and it wasn't meant for us. I'm a geologist by trade, which means a good chunk of my job is being out in the middle of nowhere, digging around in rocks, soil, and ancient formations that haven't seen human footprints in centuries. Most people would probably go stir-crazy spending days alone in the desert, but I've always found a strange peace in it. It's like being on another planet, quiet, timeless, untouched. That is, until something touches you back. Last summer, I was on a solo research trip in southern Arizona, not far from the Mexican border. I was collecting sediment samples and studying erosion patterns around a few ancient dry riverbeds that hadn't seen water in decades. It was a 2-day trip. I brought a reliable 4x4 truck, plenty of water, canned food, a satellite radio for emergencies, which barely worked half the time, and my old, faithful tent. I've done trips like this dozens of times. Nothing ever weird. Until this one. The first day went by like any other. I arrived around midday, parked my truck near a stretch of jagged sandstone bluffs, and set up a temporary base not far from a dry wash. An ancient riverbed that looked like it had been carved into the earth by some long-forgotten flood. The place was eerily beautiful, stark, quiet. The kind of silence you only find in truly remote places. Just the occasional rustle of a breeze against the brittle creosote bushes. I spent the afternoon taking core samples, jotting notes in my journal, and photographing the patterns in the rock walls. The sun was relentless, but that's the desert for you. When night came, I built a small fire, heated a can of chili, and leaned back against my pack, staring up at the stars. There's nothing quite like a desert sky at night. It stretches forever, unobstructed, And the stars don't just twinkle, they blaze. I remember thinking how alone I was out there, how far removed from everything. It was a peaceful kind of loneliness. That peace shattered around 2 a.m. I woke up suddenly, heart already pounding, with no idea why. At first, I thought maybe I'd heard something in a dream, but then I felt it. A deep vibration like the earth was humming. It wasn't violent like an earthquake. It was more like a low, resonant growl from deep below the surface. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then, silence. I sat up, unzipping my sleeping bag, listening. That's when I heard the dragging sound. It was faint but unmistakable. Something heavy moving across the sand. A slow, deliberate scraping, like flesh against stone. It came from outside the tent, near where the fire had burned out hours ago. I grabbed my flashlight and switched it on, but kept it low. I didn't want to make a sound. My heart was thudding so loud I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. Slowly, I reached for the tent's zipper and eased it down just enough to peer through the small opening. And I saw it. There, crawling across the sand no more than 20 feet away, was something I still struggled to describe. It looked vaguely human in shape. 2 arms, 2 legs, but it moved like it had never learned how to use them properly. Its limbs jerked and twitched as it dragged itself forward, one leg limp behind it. The skin was pale and waxy, almost glowing under the moonlight. Its spine curved unnaturally and its movements were too fluid, too boneless. It slithered rather than walked, and as it moved, it left behind a long trail in the sand. I couldn't look away. The thing paused by the fire pit, its head lolling to the side like it was listening. Then, with terrifying slowness, it turned its head toward me, and its eyes, they were huge, too large for its face, lidless with no whites, just deep, black voids that seemed to drink in the light. When those eyes locked onto mine, a wave of nausea hit me. It felt like I was falling into them, like I was being pulled into something ancient and endless. I didn't breathe, I didn't blink, I stayed frozen, flashlight shaken in my hand. Then, just as silently as it had come, it resumed crawling. It passed my tent and vanished into the shadows beyond the wash. I sat there, unmoving, for what felt like hours. Eventually, I dared to step outside, just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The desert was cold, the kind of chill that makes your bones ache. But that wasn't what made me shiver. I walked over to where the thing had been, and sure enough, there was a trail. A wide drag mark in the sand, winding past my tent and disappearing into the distance. I packed up camp in less than 15 minutes. I didn't eat, didn't finish my notes, didn't even collect the rest of my samples. I just threw everything in the truck and got the hell out of there. But the story doesn't end there. For days after I returned, I felt watched. Even back in my apartment in Tucson, surrounded by neighbors and city noise, I couldn't shake the feeling. I'd wake up at night, heart racing, convinced something was outside my window. I stopped opening the blinds. I stopped going on solo trips. I even took a few weeks off work. Eventually, the paranoia faded. I convinced myself it was a hallucination. Maybe I was dehydrated. Maybe I fell asleep and dreamed it all. That's what I told myself. Until I got a call from a colleague named Drew. Drew and I went to grad school together. He's one of the few people who actually enjoys remote fieldwork as much as I used to. He called one night, said he'd just gotten back from a site about 40 miles from where I had camped. His voice was shaky. He asked if I had ever seen anything strange in the desert. When I asked what he meant, he hesitated, then said, "Something crawled up to my camp a few nights ago. I thought it was a coyote at first, but it wasn't." He described something eerily similar to what I saw. Boneless movement, pale skin, black, lidless eyes. But his story didn't end the same way. He said it didn't leave. It circled his tent for hours. He could hear it scraping the fabric, brushing against it, breathing. Then, sometime after 3 a.m., it whispered his name. I asked if he was sure. He swore it whispered his name. He cut his trip short. He's been sleeping with the gun ever since. We met up not long after that and compared details. Our descriptions matched almost exactly. Whatever it wasn't a dream. Since then, we've heard similar whispers from a few other field workers, people who've camped in that same general area. Most brush it off, blame the heat or exhaustion, but we know better. We've been trying to map the sightings. So far, we've counted 9. Always in the same stretch of desert, always late at night, always the same dragging sound. We don't know what it is. Maybe something ancient that's been disturbed, maybe something that's always been out there, hiding just beyond the firelight. But I do know one thing. I haven't gone back. And I never will, because the desert isn't empty. Not really. Something moves beneath the sand, and it knows your name. In 2021, I got hired to do drone photography and terrain mapping for a solar energy company out in New Mexico. I was stationed in a desert area, setting up drone paths and mapping the terrain for future panels. The job wasn't glamorous, but the pay was good, and the solitude didn't bother me. I'd done similar gigs before: fly a drone, chart the topography, note elevations, and report anomalies for future solar panel installations. Basically, it was weeks of sitting in the desert, alone, letting the drone do its thing while I reviewed footage and logged GPS coordinates. Most people would call it boring, but to me, it was peaceful. Dry air, endless sky, and a kind of quiet you can only get when you're miles away from the nearest town. My base of operations was a small trailer parked out past a dry riverbed, about 30 miles from civilization. I had enough food, water, and supplies to last the week, and I stuck to a simple schedule. Launch the drone in the early morning, fly it through pre-programmed grid patterns, monitor its feed from the trailer or my truck, and review footage before sundown. The first 2 days were completely uneventful. I saw some birds, a few scattered lizards, maybe a jackrabbit once or twice. The wind was the only constant companion, humming low through the canyons. No people, no strange noises, no issues. That all changed on the 3rd day. It was late afternoon, maybe around 4:30 p.m., and I had just wrapped up the final scan of the western quadrant. I stepped out of the truck to stretch my legs and glance toward the horizon, where the sun was casting long shadows across the desert floor. That's when I saw her. A woman, standing on top of a ridge about half a mile away. At first, I thought I was seeing things. Maybe just a weathered post, or a strange rock formation catching the light in a weird way. But no. As I looked longer, it became clear. It was a person, a woman in white. She wore a long dress that fluttered slightly in the breeze, and her hair, black and shoulder length, drifted with it. She stood with her arms at her sides, facing my direction, though I couldn't make out her face from that distance. I lifted my arm and gave a small wave instinctively, more to acknowledge her than anything. She didn't move, didn't wave back, didn't even tilt her head or shift her weight, just stood there, unmoving. It was strange, but I figured maybe she was a hiker or a local wandering through. It was an odd spot to be standing, but people do odd things. I shrugged it off and went back to packing up for the day. Later that evening, back in the trailer, I loaded the drone's SD card onto my laptop and started reviewing the footage. I always did a quick scan to make sure the files weren't corrupted and that the grid was fully covered before backing everything up. The first half of the footage was standard. Sand, brush, dry riverbeds, distant rock formations, nothing out of place. But then, I reached the segment from the final grid sweep, the same time frame when I'd spotted her on the ridge. There she was, the woman. In the video, she was standing in the same exact spot I saw her, top of the ridge, in white, hair moving slightly in the wind. What caught my attention almost immediately was how still she was. Not just standing still, but unnaturally still. The drone had passed that ridge 3 separate times over a 20-minute span, and in each pass, she was in the same exact position. Arms down, dress slightly shifting, but her body, her posture, unchanged. No repositioning, no swaying, no shifting weight. It was like someone had copied and pasted her into each frame. And even stranger, her shadow didn't change. The sun was lower with each pass, yet the angle of her shadow remained exactly the same. That shouldn't be possible. I sat back in my chair, a little unsettled. I've dealt with glitches before, bad pixels, time jumps, artifacts, but this was different. The footage was crystal clear, and everything else looked perfectly normal. Trees swayed, dust kicked up in the wind, lighting shifted. Everything moved, except her. Still, I told myself it was probably just some bizarre trick of perspective. Maybe she wasn't human. Maybe it was a statue, a memorial or art piece. It wasn't until I watched the final clip of the day that I felt my stomach drop. The drone had made an unscheduled movement near the end of the scan. It dropped altitude by about 50 feet due to a gust of wind, drifting slightly off the grid. That deviation brought it closer to the base of the ridge, and that's when I saw her again. Only this time she wasn't on the ridge anymore. She was at the bottom of it, closer, maybe 60 yards from where the drone hovered. And this time, there was no mistaking it. She was facing the drone directly, staring up at it. Her face was pale, and her dark hair framed her head like a shadow. But it was her smile that stopped me cold. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It wasn't even a threatening one. It was wrong. Wide. Unnaturally wide. Like someone had taken invisible hooks and pulled her mouth back farther than a human's should go. Her lips were parted just enough to show her teeth. Rows of them, clenched together in this horrible, rigid grin. Her eyes, black and expressionless, never blinked. Her body didn't move. Only that face, frozen in this terrible mask of glee, stared up at the drone like she knew it was watching her. Then the video cut out. Static. Connection lost. I stared at the screen in disbelief. That clip, the last one, refused to load after that point. I tried reloading it, tried different programs, nothing. Corrupted. It wouldn't even thumbnail. It was like it had been swallowed, erased. Everything up to that moment was fine. But the second she got close, gone. The next morning, I drove back to the ridge. I needed to prove to myself that it was nothing, that I hadn't seen what I thought I'd seen. The sky was overcast, wind low. I hiked up the slope where she'd first stood, boots crunching over dry gravel. But when I got there, I found nothing. No footprints, no broken twigs, no disturbances of any kind. The ground looked untouched. I walked the length of the ridge, scanned the valley below, even checked the base where the drone had seen her last. Nothing. Like she had never been there. Back in the trailer, I tried one last time to open the corrupted clip. Still nothing. That's when I decided to ask my supervisor. I didn't expect much, but I figured if anyone had seen strange things out here before, it would be him. So I mentioned it casually, just asked if anyone had ever reported seeing people wandering out in this sector. His response chilled me to the bone. He looked at me for a long second, then said quietly, "You're not the first to see her." That was all he said. No elaboration, no joke. He just walked away, leaving me staring after him with a knot growing in my gut. I finished the assignment 2 days later, filed my reports, packed my things, got the hell out of there, but I never forgot her. Sometimes I dream about her now, standing on that ridge, her white dress fluttering in the wind, that awful, toothy smile locked in place like it's carved into her skull. And always, she's looking at me. I've done a lot of drone work since then. Different states, different landscapes, but I've never gone back to New Mexico. And I've never seen anything like her again. I don't know what I saw that day, a ghost, a spirit, something worse. But I know this, the desert keeps secrets, and some of them smile back at you.